to invite some kind soul to give me a glass of water. Thanks, Isabel. So the story of the healing of Bartimaeus, which is our text this morning, this is actually a bookend to another story of healing earlier in Mark's Gospel. Back in chapter 8 of Mark's Gospel, Jesus and his disciples come to a town called Bethsaida. And some people in the village there brought a blind man to Jesus for healing. And at that time, Jesus takes some saliva on his hands and he touches the man's eyes. And strangely, the man doesn't see clearly after that first laying on of hands. He could see, but it said that people looked like walking trees to him. So Jesus laid his hands on the man a second time. This time the man looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And it begs the question, why would Jesus have to lay hands on the man twice? You know, it's the only recorded time in the Gospels where Jesus does a healing twice. Right? Was he having a bad day? Not quite there. Was it a particularly stubborn form of blindness? More likely, Mark usually has a point when he records something. He has a point that he wants to make. And this section of Mark's Gospel that begins with this healing of the blind man at Bethsaida and ends with the healing of Bartimaeus at Jericho. This chunk of teaching deals with Jesus' authentic call to authentic discipleship. It's in this section that Jesus talks about his impending death, right? He's talking about where he's headed in Jerusalem. And it's in this section that the disciples end up completely missing the point about what Jesus is saying. So Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, but then rebukes Jesus when Jesus speaks about his death. After the second time that Jesus speaks about his death, he finds that his disciples have been arguing amongst themselves about who among them would be the greatest. And then finally, last week, we heard about when Jesus had finished speaking about his death the third time, James and John, two of his disciples, came up to him with a request to be seated at his right hand and his left hand when Jesus came into his glory. And by starting off this section of the Gospel with the story of the healing of the blind man in Bethsaida, a healing that required Jesus to lay hands twice, Mark's making the point that authentic discipleship, real discipleship, the kind that Jesus desires, will be very difficult for his followers to accept and understand. The discipleship that Jesus speaks of threatens to turn everything that we know upside down. And we may take a little while. It may take a little while for us to start seeing the way Jesus wants us to see. Right? It may take some time for us to start seeing the way Jesus wants us to see in this authentic discipleship. The Gospel makes it clear that Jesus laid hands on the man twice, not because Jesus was unable to heal the first time, but because the blind man needed to see, to look intently, before his sight was fully restored. The fact is that our response to Jesus' call to authentic discipleship, the kind of discipleship that would deny ourselves, that would take up our cross and follow him, a discipleship that understands that if you want to be great, you have to be a servant. That if you want to be first, you have to be the last and the slave of all. Our response to such a call to discipleship is often slow, if we actually respond at all. And sometimes Jesus has to call us more than once. Sometimes Jesus has to call us twice, multiple times, many, many times, before we begin to start seeing what Jesus wants us to see. The story of the healing of blind Bartimaeus, coming as it does, immediately after this brash request of James and John for greatness, after the disciples were jockeying again for position, it shows that even after all of Jesus' teaching with them, even after him being with them, they don't get it. And in fact, it's a blind beggar who understands, who gets it, not the fully sighted disciples who have been traveling and learning from Jesus all this time. Bartimaeus, it's Bar-Timaeus, son of Timaeus, was a blind beggar who sat by the roadside. He lived off the pity of others. Blindness in the days of Jesus was rather common, and it was usually caused by unsanitary conditions, spread by flies, and aggravated by the hot desert sun and the blowing sand. But blindness, just like every other form of physical defect, was attributed in those days to the sins of the individual or the parents of that individual. If you were blind, it was because of something that you or your parents had done. Most people then would have lacked a true sense of compassion for the blind because they're just getting what they deserved. The blind were often ignored, often quarantined due to fear of contagion. People thought that you contract blindness, which then, of course, being isolated led them to other diseases. And at best, they were just merely tolerated. So Bartimaeus was sitting there on the roadside, tolerated, when he heard that Jesus was coming down the street. And he began to shout out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Even though he was blind, Bartimaeus could see what the disciples couldn't. He understood that this Jesus coming down the road was the Son of David, the Messiah, the one whose presence could absolutely transform and change his life. So he started to shout out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the crowds tried to silence him. Shh, quiet. How often is that the case? How often do those of us who have access to Jesus, how often do we try to silence those whose access might be restricted? How often do we try to keep quiet those we think have no access, who have no right to access Jesus? How often do we try to silence those whose ability to see what we find so difficult to see in Jesus? Right? That their ability to see in Jesus that which we find so difficult. How often do we find that difficult and say, don't talk. It makes us uncomfortable. So they tried to silence Bartimaeus, but he won't be deterred. And the crowd's discouragement only serves to embolden him more. And he shouts louder and louder, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus hears him. And more than that, Jesus calls to him. And suddenly the crowd that's been trying to shut Bartimaeus up says to him, "It's your lucky day, Bart. It's your lucky day. He's heard you. Get up, get up. Take heart, get up." So Bartimaeus gets up, throws off his cloak, and goes to Jesus. It's interesting that Mark records that Bartimaeus threw off his cloak. Remember, Mark doesn't write stuff unless it's important, right? Like the double healing. Why didn't he just fold up his cloak and put it somewhere? Why didn't he roll it up like a mat, stick it under his arm? Why did he take it with him? The cloak might have been the only possession that this blind man had in his life. It might have been the place, it might have been the thing that he rolled up under his head when he went to sleep. It might have been the thing that kept him warm at night outside. It might have been the only source of security that he had. And yet when Jesus called, he threw aside that security blanket and he came to Jesus with a full anticipation of someone expecting a new life. Right? I'm not going to need this anymore. He went to Jesus as someone with a full anticipation of a new life. Then Jesus says something very interesting to Bartimaeus. He asks him the same question that he asked James and John when they came up to him and said, "We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And so Jesus says to Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus doesn't say, "I'd like to sit at your right hand or your left hand." He doesn't want to be first. He doesn't want to be second. He doesn't even want to be third. He's very, very clear about what he wants. "My teacher, let me see again. Let me see again. Just give me back my sight." It's amazing how clearly we can see our needs when those basic needs are not met. Right? It's pretty amazing how clearly we can see our needs when our basic needs are not met. the date today? It's 28th. So less than 2 months to Christmas, right? What do you get? What do you get for the man or the woman or the child who has everything? It's a question that many of us will be asking as we start shopping for Christmas. It's a quandary that most of the world cannot imagine being in, right? It's a question that most of the people in this world cannot imagine asking themselves. What do you get for someone who already has everything? For many in our world, the answer of what do you want? It's pretty basic. I want a place where I can sleep with a roof over my head. I just want a job. I just want to have clean water to drink. Reminds me. I just want enough food to feed my family. I just want safety from harm, from war, from anger, from abuse, from exploitation, from oppression. I don't want to be the first or the greatest. I just want to see again. For the majority of our world, that's their answer. I just want to see again. I just want my basic needs met. And I wonder who the blind among us are today. And I wonder if they actually see a lot better than we do. Whether they see Jesus for who he really is and what he's truly capable of, rather than seeing Jesus for who we would like him to be. I wonder if the irony isn't that we, like the disciples, those closest to Jesus, those most familiar with him, are the truly blind ones, and the ones in danger of not seeing at all. Most of us, a lot of us, come from a church background. We come from families that have had a church background. You know, we may have been in the church for most, if not all, of our lives. The church and Jesus have always been part of our lives, but it doesn't always mean that Jesus has been a vital part of our lives, right? Jesus has always been there, but has he been there in a vital way? For a lot of us, he's just kind of always been there on the periphery. Sundays, religious holidays, in our prayers before meals. But Jesus has been so easily available to us that the danger is that maybe we become blinded to his transformational presence and power. If Jesus came among us and asked us the question, what do you want me to do for you? What would our answer be? If Jesus came among us and said, what do you want me to do for you? Do you have an answer? Do you have an answer? You know, because he is, and he does ask us. He is here, and he is asking us, what do you want me to do for you? Do we know? Is there something we want Jesus to do for us? And if there isn't, if you can't think of something right away, I want Jesus to do this for me, what does that say about us? I wonder. Remember this authentic discipleship that Jesus is calling us to embrace, this upside-down kingdom that Jesus speaks of, this following Jesus business isn't just some routine we keep to because we're respectable people, because it's the sensible thing to do. In fact, by the world's standards, it's the most impractical thing that we could do. Now, I shared this story at the end of last week's service, but I think it bears repeating. Bishop Will Willimon, back when he was at Duke Chapel, once lamented to a group of students that so few students were attracted to their services at Sunday at Duke Chapel. And one of the students said to him, "Go easy on yourself, Professor Willimon. Duke is a very selective school with very bright students," she said. "I think most of them are smart enough to figure out that if they gave their lives to Jesus, he would only make their lives more difficult. I think it's amazing that you get as many people to come to Jesus as you do." Isn't that true? Like, why? Why would you want to be a servant? Why would you want to be a servant and the slave of all? Why would you want to deny yourself and pick up your cross when you don't have to? When our entire society tells us to treat yourself because you deserve it. Why would you want to lose your life for Jesus' sake and for the sake of the gospel when so many around us are only about looking out for themselves? Following Jesus is a radical act of discipleship into an upside-down kingdom. It's not an easy thing to do, and there's always a danger that we become blind to both the challenge of discipleship and the ability of Jesus to transform us and equip us to meet that challenge. I think we have to start by admitting our blindness. Right? in asking Jesus, crying out to Jesus, to let us see again. Jesus, I want to see again. So how does that work? How does that work? I've been thinking that it might work in a way that may not be always obvious to us. You know, people who do research with blind people, especially those who are born blind or become blind at an early age, they say that people who are blind can learn to reorganize the part of their brains that would normally be associated with eyesight, and that part of their brain can be focused to deal with other senses, including hearing. That's why it's often said that the blind have a more acute sense of hearing than those who can fully see. I think that if we want to be able to see as Jesus would have us see, that we actually need to develop our sense of hearing. We want to see as Jesus wants us to see. We actually have to develop our sense of hearing, of listening to the voices of people like Bartimaeus, who often get shut out. There are many, many voices around us and around our world who know exactly what they would say in response to Jesus' question, what do you want me to do for you? I think of that caravan moving toward the U.S. border from Central America, whom President Trump has called the military to keep out at all costs. Would they know how to answer Jesus' question, what do you want me to do for you? Probably. I think of the people who are grieving this morning in the aftermath of the horrible synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. In their grief, in their utter devastation, would they know how to answer Jesus' question, what do you want me to do for you? I think so. I think of the poor and the hungry, the homeless on our streets, the socially marginalized, the bullied, the abused, those discriminated against because of their race or their sexuality or their disability. Would they know how to answer Jesus? I think that they would. If we want to see again, if we want to see again, maybe we need to listen to those voices and to the voices of all people for whom Jesus is a desperate, vital, fundamental answer to their most basic needs. And as we listen and as we learn, we may also begin to see again. See in the way that Jesus wants us to see. And that we may also become transformed by Jesus to be able to grow in the authentic discipleship that He desires for us in this upside-down kingdom that He preaches of, where the blind see. Authentic discipleship, it's difficult. Let's be honest about it. It's difficult. It's difficult. The way of the cross is not easy. But my friends, our Lord and our Master is the one that calls us to this path. Right? It's the way of Jesus. And we are to follow in His footsteps as disciples. And Jesus, let's be clear about this, is not just some good man or some great leader. We don't baptize people in the name of a good man or a great leader. Jesus is the Son of David. He's the Son of God. He's the Messiah. He's the one who did die on the cross, just like He told the disciples that He would. He's also the one who rose again, just like He told the disciples that He would. Jesus is the one through whom God came to be with us as the fullest expression of God's grace, and in whom the fear of death has been overcome, and the power of darkness and evil has been rendered powerless. Jesus can help us to see again. And Jesus is calling to us today. He's calling to us today. What do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? Asks Jesus. Pray that we would grow in our discipleship so that we might be able to answer. Thanks be to God. Amen.